looking from the chat. Okay, guys, I'm hoping that you can hear me. Let me know if you can, and I have to just give you a heads up. I am just trying to figure this out here. I'm going to say admit all. Okay. I don't know if you guys can even see my screen here. I'm just trying to muddle my way through this software. So let's see, where do I get, oh, I want to share. I'm going to share my main screen. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay, sorry guys. I'm hoping that you can hear me. I'm actually looking from the chat window here so I can see if people are on or not. So just one second. I apologize for the delay here, but this is new to me. Okay, here we go. Sound is good. Okay, you guys can see, and you guys can see my screen? Yeah, okay, awesome. Hey, Nate, cool. Okay, and Nate, just everybody, Nate is the IT guy from cgma. He's just making sure I don't go too far off the rails. Nate, I initially started the meeting by clicking on the link, and then people couldn't get in, and I ended up exiting that meeting, going to the cgma website and entering through the live Q&A. I know we talked about just clicking on the link, but I don't know if I did something wrong. We can also talk about it later, but since you're here, I just wanted to give you a heads up. With that, let's see, one person's waiting. I wish there was a way to just unlock this room so people could just join, because I'm going to have a tendency to have people waiting if I don't notice. Okay. Everybody, okay, we're going to get started. Once again, I apologize for this. It's probably going to be a little bit rough just because I don't know the software, but I'm sure I'll get the hang of it. We'll be fine by the end of this session. Okay, cool. Nate, we can talk later. We can talk this week or something, so don't sweat it. Just want to give you a heads up. Okay, cool. And I don't know, can you guys see the chat window, or do you guys have your own chat window? In the past, I would just show this so everybody could see who is saying what, and we have our own chat. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this over here to the side. I'm going to leave this over here to the side, and just feel free to shout out and let me know if something is not working or if you can't see something that I'm talking about. Okay. All right. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we did in week 1. I'm going to jump over to the submission gallery, but everybody had pretty good work. I thought everybody was getting the hang of it. I wanted to talk about a couple of things just real briefly, and I just also want to open it up to anybody. If you have any questions or anything you want to discuss, just feel free to shout it out. Let me know, and like I said, I'll do my best. I'm still a little disoriented with the chats and the system and letting people in and everything. It's just a new system. Okay, so on a few of you, actually I'm going to use Bjorn here as an example. I'm really just going to look at the reference. But I know on a few, actually I think that one's not available. But for a few people, and with several people, I talked about contrast ratio and just what to look for. So whenever I talk about contrast ratio, what I'm talking about is the relationship of how bright the sky is versus how bright the sun is. Or another way to put it is how bright the sun is versus how dark your shadows are, right? Because your shadow, the value of your shadows is going to be the sky dome. However bright the sky dome is, that's going to be your value of your shadows. That's not something that you need to, like when I light a level, I don't think how dark are my shadows going to be. I don't stress out about that. I just start with the dome, get it blocked out, get it feeling good, then bring in the sun. Now, after that point, if I see that the contrast ratio is not what I want it to be, I'll either increase or decrease the sun, or increase and decrease the sky, depending on what my needs are. And I talked a little bit on a few people's critiques. We talked a little bit about HDR. The way we handle it at work, when I'm working on Call of Duty, we have a specific way of handling our ambient, our skylight. It's not specific to the sky. It's actually, what is specific about it is that we're capturing our own sky. So at the time that I'm out photographing the panorama, and I'm just going to pull up a panorama. This is one that I did. This is just a practice panorama. So this actually, it's a bad example in that it doesn't have the measurements. You can see here that I have a chrome ball and a matte ball. I actually don't use this setup anymore. We use something slightly different. But the point is, when I take captures of the sky, I'm going to have certain measurement information in here that's telling me how bright the EV is, the exposure value. And when I say exposure value, that relates to a camera. So the same way that a camera derives an exposure value, and that exposure value is based on three things. It's based on the shutter speed, it's based on the aperture of the lens, and it's based on the ISO, or how sensitive the film back is on the camera, right? And those three components added together make up an exposure value. You can reach the same exposure value in different ways, right? So you can have a high ISO, a very fast shutter speed, and a small aperture, and get same ISO as if you had a very low ISO, slow shutter speed, and wide aperture, right? You can still get to the same point, to the same value in different ways. But that exposure value is a measurement of the brightness in the scene at a whatever given point you're sampling. And that exposure value is, we have an analogous tool in our game to that exposure value. So it's a long way of saying, it's a really long roundabout way of saying that when I'm out in the field, I measure how bright the sun is, both in the shadow and I measure how bright the light is both in the sun and in the shadow. And then when I go back to the studio and I put that sky dome in the game, I can have an idea of what my values need to be in game. And what I shoot for is that when I put the sky in, I'm getting the same intensity, the same exposure values in game as I was getting in the real world. Now that's depends on a couple of things that I have to control. Number one, I have to know what my measurements are in the field. So when you're downloading an HDR image and you're getting that from, who knows where, free HDRs.com, we don't know what information is. And even in this image here, I don't know what the exposure value is on the ground. So it's impossible for me to recreate that accurately. Therefore, I end up having to rely on just eyeballing it. Does it feel right? Does it look right? What's important about the HDR image is that the relationship between the bright part of the sky and the dark part of the sky is consistent. So even though this exposure value may not be what I recorded initially in the field, the relationship is correct. So I can eyeball this and adjust my intensity in Unreal to get that to a place where it works. Visually, it works, right? Aesthetically, it works. Mathematically, it might be off. Mathematically, I might be in the wrong place, but visually it's working. And because there's a consistent relationship between the values in this sky, I'm not too worried about being off, at least for the sake of this class, for the sake of this particular session and how far we're getting into setting up skies and setting up HDR images. It's fine. And so with that, I'm also going to be eyeballing the color, the intensity, and the direction of my directional light, my sun in Unreal in the game. And that's fine. That's fine. I have a lot of information here to tell me what's going on. I know which way the sun is. I know where the sun is in the sky because I can see it. I know where the shadows are. I also know how dark the shadows are, right? So I have an idea. These are all eyeball measurements because I don't have actual measurements from the field, but I can still put together a good amount of information, right? I know how dark my shadows are. I know how bright my sun is. I know where the sun is. I know how high the sun is. I know how long the shadows are, right? And I can use those things the same way that when I open up your scene and I look around, I can tell where your sun is without having to see it because I can see where the shadows are. And I can see how strong the shadows are and at what pitch they are and if they match what's in the background or not. So I'm using the same things. I'm looking at the same information to try and cobble together what my values are. And like I said, for this class, that's fine. That's going to be completely fine. When we yeah, sure, go ahead and do that. I'm installing Unreal 4.2. It seems like every time I do this class, there is a new version of Unreal, so I'm always a version behind, or a couple, sometimes more than one. And just to give you a quick heads up, if you're wondering what the scene files were authored in, I think they're 4.18 for the project files. Let me go to, but if you look in the where the zip file is, it'll say week whatever, and then it'll say 4.18. So this one, I did it in 4.18 at the time. That was the newest version of Unreal. You can always go back. You shouldn't, first of all, you shouldn't really have a problem using the newest version of Unreal. It'll probably give you a dialog that says, do you want to open this, or do you want to open this as a copy? So you can open it as a copy if you don't want to edit the original one, or you can just, edit the original one and download it again if you have a problem. So that's not an issue, but sorry. But what I wanted to show you is in the launcher, if you click on this arrow tab, you can actually have, I can open up older versions if I have an issue. So I just installed 4.2. The scenes were done in 4.18. So it just seems like every 3 or 4 months they come out with a new version. So that's fine. Anyway, that's how you can get to previous versions, or you can just use the latest one and convert the scene or open it as a copy. Anyway. Okay, let's see, Bruno. While we were on Sky HDR, I have a few questions. What is the average good Sky resolution, let's say for a current gen PC console game? And secondly, when you tweak the values in Photoshop, do you just play with the exposure or offset gamma? If you could explain the difference. Yeah, sure. Okay, so for your first question, an average good resolution, it depends on what is the resolution that your Sky is going to be in game. So for example, in Call of Duty, I believe we're running, I want to say like 8K by 4K. Essentially, we're generating cube maps. So we're generating, if you take the sky and break it up into a cube, it would have 6 sides. Each one of those textures, right? Each one of those 6 textures for the top, bottom, and then 4 all the way around would have a resolution of 2K. So you can think about it as 2K by all the way around, so that's 4K, and then top and bottom, that's another 2. So yeah, actually I think it's like 4K by 6K, I think is what it is, or maybe 8K by 4K. But anyway, my point is that it is really just dependent on what the resolution for the game is. So in our game, we wouldn't go bigger than that because our game doesn't handle a resolution larger than that. So I think for Unreal, for what we're doing here, you can just export the map. I think you should be fine. You can always hold on to the original. Like this one is, I don't even know what this one's at. Image adjustment. No, image size. Okay, so this is almost 8K by 4K. It's a little bit lower. Yeah, so at work, I believe we're a little bit over 8K by 4K. But mind you, that's broken up into 6 different maps. It's a cube map. So for here, I would say 2K, you'd probably be fine, at 2K in Unreal. And the truth is, think about whatever resolution you're viewing the game. If you're viewing it at, 640 by 480, you don't need a sky that's bigger than well, you need it bigger than 640 by 480, but you don't need a huge resolution if the output resolution is fairly low. So I don't know. I think that you're fine at 2K. You can make it 4K if you want, but I did all of mine at 2K. Also because of just, I didn't want to have to transfer, 4K size textures. So, but I think you'll be fine. When I tweak values in Photoshop, I would generally just rely on the exposure. So I'd go to adjustments and do an exposure adjustment here. What I would do is do an adjustment layer, so I can go back to this and edit the exposure. And this can be, I believe this is analogous to a stop. So when we get into the exposure bias in Unreal, you'll see that it has, let me see if I have this up. But Unreal has really, if you haven't noticed already, Unreal has really good documentation. If you hover over just about any channel, it'll tell you what it does. And sometimes it's better than others. But for the most part, it has really good, I'm sorry, I don't have what I'm looking for, but when you put in, when we get into exposure, there is an exposure, there are various controls. One of them is an exposure bias, and it essentially correlates to the exposure here. And the way exposure works, each EV stop is not just one time greater or smaller than the previous. It's exponential. It's an exponential multiplication of energy. So a stop of 2 is twice as strong as the original. A stop of no, I'm sorry. One stop higher is twice as strong. 2 stops higher is 4 times as strong, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the way exposure works. So I would work with, like I said, I would work with the exposure for our purposes. If you want to know how it works in our game specifically, we don't use gamma. Gamma has more to do with like the white balance of the image or of your screen. It's usually gamma is something that you adjust for depending on what your output platform is, whether that's sRGB or HDR or whatever that's going to be is going to determine whatever your gamma is doing. But we generally don't touch that as artists. So in our game, we actually can go into the material for the sky, and in that material we have an offset that we can place. So it's very easy. If I measure the EV, what I do is when I photograph a sky, I'll have a whiteboard in here, and I'll write down the exposure value is this for the sun. So let's say it's 12 in the sun, and I get into the game without any modification. I just bring the sky in, and what I get is a value of let's say 3. Then I know I'm off by 3 stops. And it's as easy as just putting +3 in the material. That's a proprietary tool that we have, and it makes it really easy. The math that it's doing is a little bit more complicated, and it's doing like a log conversion calculation where, because I'm not just adding a value of 3 to my existing exposure, I'm multiplying whatever the 3 stops, the exponential difference of that is. So it's an easy way for me to just be able to type in, if I know how many stops I'm off, I can just type that into the, at work, I can type that into there's a parameter in the material for the sky, and that does the math for me. Before we had that set up, we actually had to do a rather convoluted, we had to run it through a rather convoluted equation. That gave us an odd value, and then the way that they had us adjust that, I don't know why. This was what the rendering engineers asked us to do, is not to use the exposure tweak in Photoshop, but to use an adjustment layer that was, it was a bizarre setup. We'd have to pick a color, put it into whatever the number that the calculator gave me, that would be the value in HDR. So if it said, your value is 3.4. Let's say 3.14. Nope, that's not what I want. Sorry, guys. I would say my value is 3.14, 3.14, 3.14, 3.14, right? And this value of white, we're in floating space, so we're above 1. We're in 32-bit value. So this value, let's say that was my offset, 3.14. I would fill a multiply layer in Photoshop, right? I can do it. Anyway, I'm just giving you an example of like a rather convoluted way that we made the adjustment. So there we go. I do that, and then you set this to multiply, and my exposure is being boosted. Now, why that is different to them than just taking the exposure value and adjusting it, I don't know. That was just at work. For whatever reason, they had us do it this way until we had the actual multiplier in the material. So now it's really easy, but it was a little bit challenging. Okay, Jeff, do you have any suggested resources on capturing an HDR sky? I can point you to information as far as how it's done, and I'm happy to talk about it. Um, the problem with capturing HDR sky is it requires a certain amount of camera equipment that can be somewhat expensive. So a website that I like, and I know I mentioned it in the demo, is NoEmotion, noemotion.net. And this guy has, in addition to having lots of HDRs that are super useful, he kind of breaks down the equipment that he uses. So essentially, this is what I'm using at work as well, or something very similar to this. Might not be the same brand. I'm using a Canon 5D Mark II at work. It's just a work camera. It's a little bit old, and I'm using that with a 8 to 15 millimeter lens, but I use it at all the way at 15. And then this is a nodal head. This is not quite the same one that I have at work, but the concept is the same. This part here attaches to your tripod, and you're able to rotate the camera around this pivot point. You're able to rotate it in different degrees, right? You want to know exactly how many degrees. For example, I capture 2 rows of images at 60-degree intervals. So I end up with, I think I end up with like 42 images total. And those images, the reason I end up with 42 images is because I'm not just taking one image, but like he's showing in the picture here, I'm taking multiple brackets. He did about 7 here. So I'll do 7 if I'm in the field. If it's a sunny day and it's not changing too much, I'll do 7 brackets, meaning 7 different exposure values that then get combined into one image. If the light is changing really quickly, meaning it's sunset or morning and I'm losing light really fast, I have to take the panoramic much quicker. I will do maybe 5 brackets instead of 7, just because time's a factor. So you can read this stuff. This is, and I'll post. You guys have this, but I'll post this link here in the messages. I love this guy's website. He really breaks down his process and the tools that he uses. Gets pretty technical as far as some of the questions they were asking him, but for the most part, this is a setup. Obviously, I would have a tripod. You can actually see the tripod right here in the image, and you can see in the shadow. You can actually see the camera on the nodal head, right? So let's get rid of that. So it spins around this point, and the camera. There's another pivot point here where the camera can look up and look down. So I usually do about 45 degrees up, 45 degrees down, and I do 2 rows of that at 60-degree increments. That is it's gonna vary. It's gonna be different depending on the camera, the lens, the tripod. You know, this is, I know what these values are because I've done this a lot and I've made a lot of mistakes with it, and I've kind of figured out, like anything else, you know, you make enough mistakes and you figure out where you know, where you're going off the rails and what you can do a little better. I highly recommend checking out this guy's website. This promote control, this is a remote control for just automating the bracketing and the firing off of the camera. Because as you can imagine, even if this is on a tripod and it's all secure, if you push that button, there's still just a little bit of vibration. If you have to change settings, there's a lot of room for error, to accidentally take the wrong picture, to accidentally set up you don't want to do that. What you want to do is set it all up so that it's ready to go, and then you hit a button on a remote and it takes the picture. You don't want to touch the camera, you don't want to move it, because you want each one of these brackets to be in the exact same position so that when you combine them, they all match up evenly. And a big part of this node and the way we're doing these pictures is the software that you use to combine these images is correcting for parallax. So you want all of these to be the same, so when it applies the correction for that parallax, it matches all of those images, and you don't get, you know, like ghosting or any kind of weird artifacts in the HDR. There's also I believe it's free. It's kind of a little app that you can put on the chip of the camera called Magic Lantern. And that's what we use, just because the 5D doesn't have any kind of automation for taking bracketed exposures. Magic lantern. Magic lantern. Let's just do this. Yeah. So what it does is it just gives you all of these kind of bootleg options here. It gives you a bunch of stuff that you can do. All we really use it for is the exposure. We set it up to automatically do. When I hit the button, it's going to take 5 different brackets at different shutter speeds, and it's going to do that consistently for all of the images. So that's probably a cheaper, more hacky way of using a remote. But I don't have the remote. I just have a little wired trigger, right, that I hold, and Magic Lantern does the rest. Okay, so and then finally, I know I talked about this a little bit in the video, and I think I probably talk about it in the upcoming videos as well. But just when I want to point this out, just when we're editing these HDR images, you need to understand that we're not just editing. It's not just like a JPEG where the pixels that you see are the pixels that you get. There's different intensities here, right? So that's represented in this scaler here. I can move through the different brackets of the HDR image all the way from the very dark to the very bright. That being said, there's a whole big range here for me to paint in. So I don't just want to start painting. If I just take a brush and just start painting in here, first of all, this stroke that I just put in is going to be generating light. It's going to be generating energy. If I measure that, I'm going to grab, let's open up this color palette, this color swatch, and we'll grab the picker. So I'm measuring that. That's an exposure, not an exposure. That is a value of 3.0831, right? Well over 1. So we're not in 0 to 1 range. All right, this is already 3. This is already in the 3s. If I measure the sun, I'm going to bring this exposure down so I can see it. Measure the hot part of the sun. It's at 20. Right, so that's the intensity of these pixels in this image. If I measure the sky, it's at 0.08. It's an RGB color. It's not straight white. So but you can see that these values are different. There's a huge range here. So me just painting willy-nilly in here is a really bad idea, because this is going to affect my scene in ways that I can't predict and in ways that I can't control. So I just want to point that out. Please feel free to ask me any questions about that if that still doesn't make sense. But my point is, let's say I want to take out this bit of the horizon. I just want to have water all the way across. Well, what I'm going to want to do is clone that, because when I'm cloning, I'm still copying information from one place to another, but at least I know that the information I'm copying is consistent across all of those brackets, right? So I can still do things that'll mess up the image. If I clone a piece of the sun and put that there, I just put pixels that are at a value of about 20, give or take, into the scene. So I'm still going to be careful what I do, but this is a lot safer than just getting a brush and painting. It's really hard to paint in HD or in HDR. Some people do it. Some studios do it. And also different studios have different standards as to how photoreal or how PVR their values need to be, right? So for a game like, let's say God of War, it looks beautiful. Those skies are probably photo bashed or, composited in different ways. It depends on what you're doing. Obviously, you can see this is pretty rough in here. I'd have to clean that up, but at least these values are more consistent than if I just took a paintbrush and just painted across the sky. That would give me vastly inconsistent results. So I just want everybody to understand that and to be aware of what you're doing when you're painting in HDR space. And some people are really good, and they can come in here and they can, they'll paint at whatever this, cloning. Sorry. They'll paint at whatever this value is, and then they'll come in here and then they'll go to the next bracket and they'll paint, a little bit more or whatever that value is, and they'll come in and they'll go to the next bracket and they'll paint at whatever that value is. And yeah, you're painting through all the different stops, right? You can see as I crunch the exposure, you can see the different values that I've painted, but that's still vastly inaccurate, We don't do this. We definitely don't do this on our game. Some people do it on some games. I just want you to understand what you're doing and what is actually going on. When you think about the energy that this is going to produce when you put this into your skylight, that's almost as bright as that. That's probably nowhere near as bright as that, but it's significantly bright is my point. So it's important to be aware of what the value, the relationships of the values that you can. Oh yeah, is that 20? Let's put that to 0. Anyway, this stuff can get pretty hairy. So my whole point in this is that I advise you to clone and not paint for those reasons. If you want to take something out, if you want to touch up a little, there's a little mistake, there's something that looks a little funny, just get the clone brush and clone it out. It's much safer. You're still going to want to be conscious of what you're painting and from where. Obviously, you want to paint data that's similar, right? I'm not going to paint a piece of this bright water over here to cover up this bush. I'm going to grab another piece of this bush here and just kind of clone that out. So you still need to be judicious about where you're grabbing information from, but I just want you to have an understanding of what you're actually doing when you're manipulating this data, because it's very powerful. This will affect your scene in huge. If you don't believe me, go in here, make a red swatch, and just keep doing that, and just put a red swatch in the sky, and then export that and put it in your game and put it in Unreal, or even better, bring the stops up a little bit and put a really big red swatch in the sky and see how that affects your game. You're going to see that. You're going to see that in your lighting. Okay, so just wanted to talk about that a little bit. I know I kind of went off the rails. Back to what I was initially saying, when I'm talking about contrast ratio, what I'm really looking at, one of the first things I look at is what is the difference between your shadow color and your sun color, right? And this is a good example because regardless of what this material is or how bright this material is, I know that I'm looking at the same material. So here's the sun, here's the shadow, and it gives me an idea of what the difference is in terms of how bright my sun is, how bright my sky is, how dark are my shadows. That's a really one of the first things I look at whenever I'm evaluating an image and trying to match the lighting is what's the contrast ratio? How bright is it? How bright is the sun? How bright is the sky? Obviously, you want to start with a sky that is representative of the look that you're going for. So if I'm going to match this snowy mountain, I'm not going to pick a desert sky. I'm going to pick something that's cold, preferably something that has some fog in it that I'm going to match to or work off of. So a lot of times you'll hear me say, okay, well, I think your contrast ratio is a little bit too high. I would bring the sky up, or I would bring the sun down. That's what I'm talking about. And then another thing that you're going to always, you're going to constantly hear me talk about throughout this course is just the readability of shapes. So if you look at this this particular example, this building here is essentially a cube, or a big rectangle, a cube with a triangle on top of it, right? And I'm looking at the way that this face reads as opposed to this face. This is a cylinder, this is a cylinder, this is a cone. There's another cube here with a cylinder on top. I'm looking at all these shapes just in their most basic form and trying to see if it reads, right? It gets a little flat in here where these values are all very consistent, but this face is a good example of separating the sides of the geometry. It's brighter on this side, it's a little darker on this side. Presumably, it's a lot brighter on the other side. This is just basic life drawing, still life skills. And I highly recommend if you've never taken a still life class, it's usually just drawing bowls of fruit. But it's really like most of my critique is just grounded in, does this shape read, right? So this is just a two-dimensional shape. This is all on flat paper drawn with chalk. So the reason that it looks round, that it looks three-dimensional, is because it's been shaded in a way that defines those shapes, right? This cylinder is defined by the rim light, by the fill light here and the rim light on the edge. The cylinder here, the key light. This is all just defined as shapes, and that's really all that we're doing in the game in 3D. We're doing the same thing. So it's the same skills. So if you've ever taken a still life class, I encourage you to draw on that experience. If you've never taken one, I encourage you to take one. And if you have taken one, I encourage you to take another one. I should take another one. I should do more. As artists, we should all, I really do think that as artists, we should always be kind of studying the basics and the foundations. Dingy, I just modified the HDR in Photoshop. I'm using Photoshop CC, and I can't create a new layer to modify the image. I think that might be a limitation of CC. I'm using, what am I using? I think I'm using like CS5 or CS6. Mine's pretty old. Let's see, about Photoshop. I'm using CS5 right now. That's just the older version I have. I know at work we use CS6. It has a little bit more flexibility as far as being able to manipulate the image, the HDR images, I mean. So I think that CC might just be limited. I'm not 100% sure. Let's see, PSD, CC, HD. Let's see what that says. No, I should probably type in something a little more descriptive. Let's try. How to merge in Photoshop. How to use merge? Okay. You know what? I don't think I'm going to find an answer really quickly. I'll probably have to dig into that a little bit, but I have a feeling that is a limitation of Photoshop CC. I just remember specifically when we started getting into HDRs at work, CC was not, we wanted to use CS6 because I think CC was limited in some way. So it could very well just be that. Photoshop, I'm using Photoshop CC. I can't create a new layer to modify the image. So you can't just create a new layer, or you can't copy the existing layer. You should be able to do both of those. But if you can't, I'll dig around a little bit more online. You can Google it as well. I think it might be a limitation of Photoshop CC. You do not have, when you're in 32-bit mode, so you'll be in this mode and you'll switch to 32 bits. Normally, like a JPEG would be an 8-bit. 32 bits is for floating point HDR, or floating point space. It's what we use for HDRs. When you're in this mode, you're going to have limited tools. So if I go to my adjustments, I don't have access to all of these tools. I have access to levels, exposure, saturation, and a couple of the photo filters, and things I don't use. But curves, different effects, brightness, contrast, that stuff is not available just because it's not, it doesn't work with the way that HDR photos need to be edited. So that is normal. You can also look for non-Photoshop alternatives. I know that's I hate it when people tell me, well, just use this. It's like Photoshop. Like, I don't want to use that. I want Photoshop to work. But if you're looking for a quick solution that's free, I think you can try. Do they still make HDR Shop? It's pretty old. HDR Shop. At this website too, this is there's a lot of information on HDRs here. It's pretty old. This is a Ed Debevec website, who's the dude that pretty much pioneered all of this stuff. But there might be, let's see, tutorials, plugin facts, documents. Let's try plugins. Oh, no, just HDR. Links. Let's try links. Anyway, HDR Shop is a rather old incarnation of an image editor that they made so that when HDRI images or HDR images were starting to become a thing, it was really the only thing you could manipulate them in. So this is pretty old. You can just go to hdrshop.com, and I think you probably have to dig around, but maybe under purchase. Do I have to purchase it? You shouldn't. It should be free. HDR Shop, HDR Shop download. There we go. Using the HDR Shop plugin. All right, this might be a little harder to find, but you get my point. I don't want to waste too much class time digging digging things up. I'm pretty sure you can find a link somewhere that has a downloader for this. Anyway, so let me know what happens with your Photoshop CC. Like I said, I think, oh, GIMP can probably deal with that as well. Yeah, and GIMP's a great example of like, man, I used to hate it when, especially back in the day, this is going to date me as to how old I am, but we used to work on SGI platforms, which were all Unix-based. And so you couldn't run Photoshop on them. They didn't have Photoshop, and we'd have to run GIMP. And people would be like, just use GIMP. It's like Photoshop. I was like, no, dude, I don't want to use GIMP. I want to use Photoshop. It can be kind of frustrating. I feel your pain. But, you know, if it's a matter of just getting it done, you know, the pain is momentary. And then once you get past that and you're able to produce whatever it is you're trying to produce, it's really helpful. Or you can also try and get your hands on, you know, Photoshop CS5 or CS6 or whatever the case may be. You know, it might not be that hard for you to get a hold of that, depending on what your situation is. So there are different tools that are accessible. Yes, GIMP, if it's still around, which I don't know why it wouldn't be. HDR Shop is probably still around. I only spent like, you know, 60 seconds trying to find it. I'm pretty sure that you can find it somewhere. Okay. So let's see, talked a little bit about contrast ratio. We talked a little bit about just editing HDRIs. I gave you a little bit of an example about that. And I also wanted to point out, like I did with the example, that reference image, where did it go? Excuse me, guys. Somehow I have like the more monitors I have, the harder it is for me to find stuff. You'd think with multiple monitors, everything would have a place. Somehow it's just messier. Oh, in terms of composition, I just wanted to point out a couple of compositional topics that I'm always harping on. So contrast ratio, the definition of shapes. When I say, hey, your shapes are really reading, or I say, hey, your shapes are getting kind of flat, and I'm not getting a lot of definition of what these shapes are, that's really what I'm talking about. Does it read as a cube? Does it read as a cylinder? Is it lit in a way where the shape is defined, or is it lit in a way where it's kind of flat? It's getting evenly lit, and you really can't tell what surface is in front of the other, right? There's no depth to it. You'll hear me talk about that all the time, and you'll find that once we get past the technical side of this of lighting, which really isn't that complicated. There's a handful of things you got to get your head around. But once you get past that, you're really going to hear me talk in much more abstract terms and just speaking about, you know, the mood, the temperature, the shapes. You're going to hear me talk about contrast. You're going to hear me talk about gradients and transition of light, which is basically, you know, if you have a wall, ideally, you know, I'm using a wall as an example, but this goes for everything in the scene. But imagine you have a flat surface and there's a light on one end of the room. You would expect to see that light be brighter on one side of the wall, and it would have a gradient as it transitioned from bright to dark. And that's really what we're looking for in most situations, is just, you know, is the light interesting? Is the light transitioning? Is the light going from bright to dark to bright to dark, from warm to cool, whatever the case may be? Or is it just a consistent flat value? And you can have flatness in terms of temperature. You can have flatness in terms of value. You know, it's not all just how bright it is. It's contrast is just, you know, if you have one thing, you also have whatever the opposite of that is, and it gives you a rhythm, right? It gives you a different, it gives you a perspective when you look at something. It's not all the same. So you're going to hear me talk about that stuff a lot. But my point is that as we get further into this class, the feedback and the concepts that we're going to be talking about are going to be more abstract and more aesthetic. And I'm going to say things like, okay, I feel like, you know, this would be moodier if you had more contrast, or if you had more, you know, if your shapes had more definition in your shapes, I feel like the composition of the scene would work a lot better. And that, to me, is the fun part of art, right? That's the art. That's the art part of it, the craft. The technical side is, you know, okay, your reflections aren't working. You probably need more reflections here, or you're probably missing light mass importance volume, or, you know, certain technical things that you need to do in lighting for games to accomplish the look. But most of those are kind of foundational things. You set up that foundation, you get that stuff working, and then you start to iterate on the actual values, the color, the intensities of your lights, all of that stuff. And that to me is the fun part, and the part that just, there's a lot of, you have a lot of options to work in that zone. Okay, so let's see. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is just to make you guys aware. I believe that, who was it? Somebody pointed out yesterday, it was Lester pointed out that, what did he point out? Sorry guys, I'm a little sidetracked here. Oh, Lester pointed out that the fog, not the fog, the lava in scene 2, in week 2, when he would hit G to go into the kind of cinematic mode where it hides all of the manipulators and your utilities, it was also hiding the lava. That is because the lava is set up as an actor. And for whatever reason, the way this was authored by Unreal, the actors are being hidden when you hit G or when you run the game. So I put up a little extra video here. You can click on this link. It's in the week 2 forum. I think I also put a link in the week 1 forum, but I figured everybody probably moved on, so I put it in week 2. Hidden game mode, not just lava, a bunch of rocks and armor pieces too as well. Scene, yeah, it was, and I tried to clean it up as much as I could, but that scene was pretty. Yeah, I agree. It was a bit messy. It's probably just fairly old from Unreal. So see if this doesn't help the actors as well. It's just all you're doing is going in there and just unchecking the hide actors flag, and it's a quick little 2-minute video that'll show you how I did it for the lava. You're welcome to follow along. I also made another video here just on recording fly-throughs of your scenes. Some people already did it. They know. They seem pretty comfortable with it, but if you don't know or don't have any kind of screen capturing tools or anything, this will give you a few options and kind of explain just the some of the basics if you need that. So feel free. I posted that up there as resources. And once again, those are you can find those both in the lecture forums for week 2. Yep, no problem, Eddie. Yeah, with that, let me see. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about? No, I think that pretty much covers it. We're at about an hour, so we can start wrapping it up. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if there's anything you guys want to bring up, more than happy to talk about it. Otherwise, I say let's wrap it up and have a great Sunday. Everybody, I hope everybody has a great weekend. And also, once again, I want to thank everybody for their work this week. I do appreciate the fact that it is a significant amount of work throughout the week, and I appreciate that you're making the effort, and whatever you're submitting at the end of the week is great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Really interesting, helpful. Yeah, my pleasure, John. Like I said, yep, Nalima, no problem. Yeah, like I said, if there's anything you guys want to bring up, otherwise, have a great Sunday. Have a great, rest of the weekend. Have a great week next week, and try to have fun with the assignments. Try to have fun with it, and make them your own. And like I said, I kind of stress. I know that some people felt like, oh, I got to go back and fix this and catch up. We're just practicing. Every week we're practicing. We're gonna do a new assignment. So it's good for you to catch up in terms of knowing what we did last week and knowing how to apply that, and don't fall behind in terms of, we covered something that somebody missed 3 weeks ago, and now they're a little bit behind. But don't feel like you have to go back and make every scene perfect. Just I think as a student, when I'm learning, it's easier for me to move on. I kind of have to force myself to do something. I like having a deadline, and I like forcing myself to move on, because every time I move on to something else, I get that thing working. I always say it looks twice as good in half the time because of the practice, because you're doing it over again. To me, it's more valuable to do a bunch of short 10-week assignments than it is to do one big, to do a bunch of 10 one-week assignments than it is to do one big, one big assignment over the course of 10 weeks, if that makes sense. Better to do 10 small ones than one big one, is what I'm saying. I feel like you learn more. So please don't stress out too much about it. Just try to make sure you're understanding the concepts, and don't worry about it. We'll come back to this. And as a matter of fact, the last 2 weeks of the class are taking any scene of your choice, and doing a relight of it, we're going to put ourselves in the pretend situation that we have a scene and the art director came to us and said, look, we need to change this from whatever it is. Just, if you did daytime, do nighttime. If you did morning, do, midday or sunset or whatever the case may be. But we're going to be exploring that situation. So there will definitely be opportunity to revisit any scene that you like. So like I said, to me, it's more important that you're getting the concepts and you're moving forward than it is that you're polishing every pixel to an ultimate extent. Okay, Bruno, like the metallic elements in the castle second floor, would you add other probes far above the ground for them? Yes. So reflections is going to be something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit throughout the course. I can actually show you real quick before we leave, but we are going to talk about this stuff again and again. So this is what Unreal recommends in terms of their reflections. They actually do, so they're saying, like, for a room like this, they would recommend putting a large probe, right? And then you would have medium-sized probes taking care of more localized detail, and then you'd have small probes taking care of, like, super unique detail, like maybe there's a monitor here or a specific lamp over here. This is it's a bit much. Like, we don't really do this in our game. Like, professionally, we wouldn't do this. Professionally, what we do is first of all, we work with volumes, with cubes. Unreal is cool because it offers both. You can work with cubes, you can work with reflection cubes, or you can work with reflection spheres. I kind of, when I did the initial demos, I kind of ended up, I didn't realize it, but I ended up using reflection spheres more because at work I have cubes and I kind of miss the spheres. The spheres have their own limitation, mainly that you can have areas like this right here where my mouse is, where something is just not getting covered because of the diameter, the way that the diameter is working. So that can be kind of tough. Cubes tend to be more precise, but I kind of like, sometimes it's nice to use a sphere because it's a little bit less precise. It's a little bit more of an organic shape. But the cubes work the same. So if I was at work, this would be maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 cubes here. Maybe 3, maybe just 2. Generally, the rule of thumb is for reflections is anytime you have a significant change in the geometry or the topology of the scene, or anytime you have a significant change in the lighting and the light values of the scene, you're going to want to have a reflection probe that represents that. And it is a bit of a balance, right? So, when we're working on our game, there is a certain memory cost, a performance cost to reflections. And it doesn't mean that we don't use them. We need them, and we use them as much as we can. But I also have to be careful that I'm not, like, this would be a bit much to do this everywhere in a production level. This would be a bit much. This would probably be 1 or 2 probes in here. And then on my particular game, we have a priority system where I can have, much like this, I can have a probe inside another probe, and I can tag that to be a higher priority, so that, let's say you were in this room, you would be getting the red reflection, but when you go inside, let's say you went under a desk, I could have a different volume in there with a higher priority, so that would take over. And it's a nice way to be able to nest probes inside of other probes. I really don't know how Unreal sorts out the priority on these probes. It seems to be a little bit smarter about it. You don't have to be so explicit. But just giving you an example, this is kind of how Unreal recommends setting up reflections. I'm telling you right now, from a professional perspective, this is a bit too much. We wouldn't do it. We wouldn't do it this heavy. It's a matter of performance as well. So, and like I said, I talk about reflection spheres a bit, but there are reflection cubes. You can use them in the same way, and you shouldn't be timid or shy about using. Go ahead and experiment with them. They are a little bit more difficult to scale in Unreal, I found. They're just kind of slower to scale. They don't seem to move as much. But sometimes it's easier, like with a situation like this, it's easier to work with cubes because everything is angular. If you had a real organic, curvy road, or you had a tunnel that was curving, that's where cubes get difficult, because they just don't lend themselves to organic shapes. So we have to kind of get creative about how we compose them. Anyway, we can talk about reflections. We will be talking about reflections more and more throughout the course. But feel free to check this out as well. And I will post that for you guys here. Boom. Cool. Awesome, guys. Yeah, love the enthusiasm. Love the participation. Like I said, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to post stuff in the Q&A. And also, I said this to everybody on their individual feedback sessions, but feel free to talk to each other and interact with each other and post on the message boards. And additionally, if you guys want, you can send me your email or send me if you have a Facebook contact. And I've set up a Facebook group for all of the students of this class and previous classes of the Art of Lighting for Games. And I encourage you guys to also go on there, meet previous students, post things that you think are cool. Sometimes I'll post things that I find that are cool, or I'll post links to other colleagues that I have that are doing cool things. But it's just a nice way to kind of have a little bit of an extended community within the alumni for this class. So I'm happy to send that out as well. Send me your just send me your preferred email, and I'll send you an invite for that. And I'll bring that up again, so don't sweat it if you missed it. Yep. Yarnis, is that how I say your name? Sorry, Yarns. No problem, man. I'm glad that you made it. Got kind of confused with the zone difference. Yeah, I'm in Pacific. I'm in LA, so it's just Pacific Standard Time. No worries. This is being recorded, so you can always check it out later. All right, guys. I think we should go ahead and wrap it up. Once again, thank you everybody for your participation and your hard work, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. So if everybody's cool, I'll leave the channel open for a little bit, but if everybody's cool, have a great weekend, man. Yep, you got it, guys.